Hey, if you like this interview, hit the subscribe button below and follow the Climate Pod. We release episodes each week going into the most critical conversations about the climate crisis. You can watch us on YouTube or listen to us on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get our podcast. We also have a Substack, The Climate Weekly, where you can become a paid supporter of the Climate Pod. And now, enjoy this interview. Well, Bill McKibben is the author of so many great books, including the first book on climate change, The End of Nature. And his latest book, Here Comes the Sun, A Last Chance for the Climate and a Fresh Chance for Civilization, is out now. Bill McKibben, welcome to the Climate Pod. How are you?
Well, what a pleasure to be with you, and many thanks for letting me join you today.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on. And I, this book, reading this book and reading your writing, it was so needed in this moment for me. And I want to talk about why I felt like this was so motivating in a time where I have really not felt highly motivated. And I think others would say the same. And so I want to talk about that motivation and where it comes from in your work and your writing. But first, I want to talk about the state of warming because I was interested and somewhat surprised to read some of the facts that you list in the book, and I was surprised. I didn't realize that because climate scientists have been studying the effects of warming trends and what's been happening and what they've been monitoring in recent years, that as you write, actually, those estimates of where we were headed, the trajectory of warming, those estimates, our trajectory of warming had been declining, right? People were analysts were projecting something like 2.6 or 2.9, right? And as more countries made commitments, that was going down. I was surprised to read that those estimates have since been going up in recent years, as what we've seen with the effects of climate change. So, what do you want people to take away when it comes to where we are at in 2025 with the state of global warming?
Well, that's one of the two crucial questions, I think. Look, when I wrote The End of Nature in 1989, we had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen, but we weren't 1,000% sure exactly when. All our estimates turned out to be on the timing to be too conservative. Things are happening faster than we had thought. Each degree of warming, each tenth of a degree of warming, seems to be exacting more of a price than we had thought. We're right now in that period that I think I was writing about back in 1989, sort of had in my mind. The temperature is clearly spiking again, um, and we're seeing things that we've never seen before. And they're happening, and I think this is the key part of the message. They're happening now in real time. There's nothing prospective about them. And the damage that they're doing is really fundamental. The thing that scares me about the last couple of years is the way that we've now begun to get pretty solid evidence of what's happening to the largest physical systems on the planet, the jet stream, the Gulf Stream, the things that are so enormous. I mean, the Gulf Stream is 100 times the flow of the Amazon River. That they feel very scary because of the size and the momentum that implies. So we're in by far the toughest place we have been in. It's very clear that we're not going to get out of this without enormous damage. And I think really circa 2025, the question is, can we get out of it without cutting civilizations kind of off at the knees? And I fear that that's an open question that we don't know the answer to. Half of the answer has to do with the response of physical systems to warming. And most of that news is coming in pretty dire. And the other half of that, of course, comes with the question of how quickly we can stop the forcings, carbon dioxide above all, pouring into the atmosphere. And that's the place where this new book, for the first time in 35 years, gives me some measured hope about the scale and pace of scalability and pace of possible solutions.
You write in the book, as you have before, this moment where Jimmy Carter puts solar panels on the White House, and it's inducted with this speech, which I always find so fascinating to go back and look at, because as he mentions, and I'm paraphrasing, this could, looking at the solar panels, this could be a piece in a museum, as I believe it is. This could be a road not taken, and in many ways, we didn't take that road, right? We didn't stop climate change when we had plenty of evidence to know that we could what we were capable of. It's fascinating though, we arrive at this moment with this dramatic boom and wind and solar, but as you write, particularly the scale of solar is unbelievable. And for so many years while you were writing about this seemed like a hippie dream, as I've heard Paul Krugman say in the past. What is it like to look at solar energy in particular and see how quickly it is growing, not only in the United States, but all across the globe, even in the global south?
Well, probably especially across the world and especially in the global south. Um, you know, Carter was correct, both in his understanding that solar could be our rescue and in his grim foreboding that it might be a road not taken. It was a road largely not taken by us in this country, but happily, the Germans, above all, decided that they were going to make an effort here. And 25 years ago, started paying high prices through their feed in tariffs for solar panels, which in turn induced enough demand that the Chinese started learning how to build these things cheaply. And now the key point is we've suddenly we've suddenly entered a world where this is not a hippie dream anymore, and where it's not only incorrect but damaging, I think, for us to keep talking about it as alternative energy, which is the ghetto we've put it in our mind for decades. It's now the common sense, straightforward, obvious way to produce power. We live on a planet where the cheapest way to make energy is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is a new and startling moment for human beings. It happened with, well, it happened with relative speed. We didn't invent the solar cell until 1954. And then it happened with stunning speed in the course of this decade. Sometime about 5 years ago, we crossed some invisible line where it became cheaper to get energy from the sun than to burn coal or gas or oil. And that set up the moment we're in. And to go back to your question about climate, there's an almost Hollywood uh, 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 sense to this whole scenario, the timing of it. June 2023 was the month when climatologists said, we seem to be hitting a new spike in temperatures. We're suddenly recording temperatures higher than we've ever recorded, at least in the last 125,000 years on this planet. And every month since June of 2023 has, as you know, been the hottest April, the second hottest October, whatever. June 2023 was also the same month when, as best we can tell, humans began installing more than a gigawatt's worth of solar panels every day. A gigawatt being the rough equivalent of, say, a coal fired power plant. Um, so these two things are happening exactly simultaneously, uh, and who knows how the race exactly will come out. But it is pretty startling to see that happening again in real time, that we can watch progressing quarter by quarter, month by month. And now the numbers are, the Chinese in April were installing 3 gigawatts of solar panels a day. That is the equivalent of a power plant every 8 hours. Um, um, uh, this is not fast enough yet around the world to catch up with the physics of climate change, but it's the first thing that's come even remotely close to that.
And the build out, as you mentioned, of clean energy in China is just unbelievable on such a massive scale. And this has been something we've been talking about quite a bit in recent weeks. In the last few years, and I promise we won't just keep this at a U.S. perspective, but just want to drill down this just for a minute. In the last few years, after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, we started to see a huge boom for renewables, for wind and solar. And you write in the book that, quote, Trump's 2024 election was like a jailbreak by an increasingly cornered oil industry. And earlier in the book, you write that, quote, I think that even as we teeter on the brink of renewed fascism, we're also potentially on the edge of one of those rare, enormous transformations in human history, something akin to the moment a few hundred years ago when we learned to burn coal and gas and oil, triggering the Industrial Revolution and hence modernity, unquote. And so we are not only in this very interesting climate inflection point, but in the United States in particular, we are in an inflection point where you're still seeing a huge build out of renewable energy. And at the same time, you are seeing a real attack on renewable energy. What have you made of that?
Well, I think that the question almost answers itself. Um, the backlash from the Trump administration and the oil industry against sun and wind is the best proof of the danger that those technologies prove to the fossil fuel model. Look, the most heartening statistic for me in the last 35 years that I've been working on this, I think, comes from California. California is the one place in the country that really early on made the commitment to try and build this stuff out. And in the last year or so, they've reached some kind of tipping point. California now, most days, supplies more than 100% of its electricity from renewable energy for long stretches of the day. At night, when the sun goes down, batteries are often the largest source of supply to the grid, batteries that didn't exist 3 years ago. And the bottom line to this is California, fourth largest economy on earth, is using 40% less natural gas to produce electricity than they were 2 years ago. 40% fall in 2 years is the kind of thing that actually starts, if we can spread it rapidly, knocking tenths of a degree off how hot the world eventually gets. But it's also, I am willing to bet any amount of money, the kind of number that catches the eye of people at hydrocarbon headquarters in Houston. When the fourth largest economy in the world needs 40% less of your product, you begin to panic. You'll recall that it was just about exactly a year ago at this time that then candidate Trump held a not very secret meeting with the oil industry where he said, if you get me $1 billion in campaign money, then you can have anything you want once I'm president. Um, they came up with about $500 million between donations and lobbying and advertising and things. Um, and that apparently was enough because they're getting everything that they want. I don't think that that's enough by itself to completely arrest this process in the US. um, I take heart from the fact that Texas, which is now the fastest growing renewable state in the country, resisted efforts in their legislature this spring to shut down the renewable surge. And I think we'll see some of it continuing. But I know that it's not enough to slow down what's happening in the rest of the world. In fact, if anything, what Trump is doing, I think, may speed the pace on the rest of the planet. If you are the ruler of some, say, Asian nation right now, you have to ask yourself, do I really want to build a huge LNG infrastructure only to have it at the whim of Donald Trump or whoever succeeds him in the White House? No, I want the sunlight that falls on my country to be the way that I provide low cost and reliable power going forward. So I think that it is possible to imagine a future where the US 20 years from now serves as a kind of fossil fuel theme park for visitors from around the world who can still get tourist visas to come look at how the world in the olden days used to run. But I think it's more likely that we just delay by some years our participation and give China the economic fruits of all the technological progress now underway. It should sicken any American to remember that both the solar cell and the lithium ion battery were American inventions. They're going to be the thing that China rides to world hegemony.
You make the example of where it started back at Bell Labs in the 1950s, and what I did enjoy about this book is that there's so much innovation happening all over the globe, innovating on the way we store power, the way we make power, the efficiency of solar panels, and so much more. And so it is exciting, all the things that are going on. But I think about Bell Labs in the 1950s. I think about the history of innovation in the United States, and as an American, it does bum me out to think about losing what an unbelievable opportunity, we have here, Bill.
Absolutely. It should be. I mean, my parents were of the generation who funded Bell Labs by putting dimes in payphones across America. Um, you know, it was that was the symbol of American scientific preeminence post Second World War. Uh, but of course, we've now decided to try and trash our entire scientific enterprise. I don't pretend to understand the America we're currently living through. I'm doing everything I can to, at Third Act and elsewhere, to try and, you know, uh, reboot America and return it to proper working order. And I have whatever naive faith that we might be able to do that at some point. But in the meantime, it is seriously sad to watch happening. The only consolation I can give you is that America, at this point, though historically the biggest contributor by far to climate change, only represents about 11% of emissions. So the fact that the rest of the world is proceeding in rational directions should be good news.
And in the United States and across the globe, we're always looking for different tactics, different strategies in the climate movement to shake things up and accelerate progress. As long as I've followed your career, this is something you're always doing in your writing, in your activism, in your work. There's always a new strategy, a new approach, a new event. I'm curious, and now that we're talking here in August 2025, what are some strategies you would like to see the climate movement apply now that can help accelerate the deployment of these technologies?
Sure. So let's talk for a minute about where we are and what will and won't work in the short run. The conceptual place, just to remember about where we are, is in a different place than the climate movement has been. For almost all of its existence, it lived in a world where fossil fuel was cheap and renewable energy was expensive. And so much of the work of the climate movement was to try and say, make fossil fuel more expensive with carbon taxes or by divestment to reduce its flow of capital or blocking pipelines to stop its easy expansion or whatever. Now we're in a different world. And so our job, in a sense, is to try and, now that the boulder has begun to roll down the hill, to get behind it and push. Um, and one of the ways that we're trying to do that right now is this thing we're calling Sun Day. The first iteration of Sun, not Earth Day, but Sun Day, will be on September the 21st, which is the autumnal equinox. And across the country, people are beginning to sign up for events of all kinds to help, really to help just demonstrate to people what I was saying before, that we've moved from a world where this was the expensive alternative energy to the world where it's the obvious choice. So in some cities and towns, people will be doing kind of mass opening up of homes with heat pumps and induction cooktops to their neighbors so they can see how they work and demystify them or get them up to their rooftops to see their solar panels. In other places, people are having parades of EVs and e-bikes. Uh, you know, in other places, they're doing solar powered concerts. Some places, people are doing protests against expanded gas pipelines that we no longer need. So there'll be different kind of things all over the place, and it is by no means too late to figure out what you can do in your community to help out on this day, which I hope will be an occasion just to help, among other things, journalists understand where we are now. Ideas get stuck in our head, and the idea that this is alternative energy is very stuck there. That's the ghetto in which this lives. And we need to break down that wall and help people understand that this is the very much the sensible way going forward.
There's been a push, as you document in the book, even from people that identify as progressive or liberal. And a big part of that is people just not wanting solar panels and wind farms in their backyards. I'm curious what frustrates you when you think about the resistance from people who are progressive, even to renewables.
Well, yeah, it frustrates the hell out of me. And so the parts that I try to get over my frustration and just deal with the parts that are dealable with, because I think there are some things that just turn out to be wrong ideas in people's minds. Let me give you an example. And you're from the Midwest, so you have a sense of how we use land in this country. Our biggest crop in America by a considerable margin is corn. And if you show most people a cornfield, they kind of think of it as a natural place. But in fact, highly engineered uh, it's a highly engineered system of solar collectors uh, that uh, that have the drawbacks of one requiring lots and lots of nitrogen and phosphorus to make them operate, nutrients that then wash into our waterways and cause all kinds of pollution, require lots and lots of pesticides and herbicides to make them operate. If you actually get in those cornfields, they're biological deserts, save for the corn plants themselves. And third, are incredibly inefficient. I mean, photosynthesis is a miracle, but not a very efficient one. Half the cornfields in America are used for ethanol. They grow gasoline. If you I was in Illinois this summer for the last summer for the New Yorker, doing some reporting on this. If you take an acre of Midwest farmland and grow corn on it, and then turn that into ethanol, you produce enough ethanol to drive a Ford F-150 about 25,000 miles. So not nothing, but if you take the same field and cover it in solar panels, you produce in a year enough electricity to drive a Ford F-150 Lightning, the EV version of the same pickup, not 25,000 miles, but about 700,000 miles. The solar panels are endlessly more efficient than this ethanol process we figured out. And, and obviously, you don't need nitrogen or phosphorus. You don't need pesticides or herbicides. In fact, you can use that same piece of land for what we're now calling agrivoltaics, uh, and take advantage of the fact that there's lots and lots of shade, which in a increasingly overheated world is actually a useful commodity. So I'm now, badgering people all the time to read the fascinating studies. I just saw one the other day from France where wine grapes grown in and among solar panels show 60% higher yields than they did when they were by themselves, because there's some shade, because there's some moisture retention. This is a possibility to try and solve a couple of problems at the same time. Where I live in Vermont, there are a number of these solar farms that have been planted with pollinator friendly plants. They're attracting huge groups of insects, and those insects in turn The farmers on the borders of these solar farms report that fruit set in their orchards is up 30 and 40% because there's so many more insects at work. This is the kind of good news that's possible when we start thinking way more creatively about our systems than we have in the past. We've had such a simplified system: find some oil, dig it up, set it on fire, and it's really kind of eliminated a lot of the creative thinking that human beings are actually good at.
You will often see this you will often see this story about clean energy, which is it's a valid exploration, right? Which is to talk about the mining and the dangers and the harm. And there are, as I've talked about a lot on this show, there are real harms to real people. You write about this in the book. And I also want to note that there are ways in which we can make mining safer. We can improve technology. There are things to do. There are ways in which we can confront this. But as you write in the book, we if we're going to have these stories, we need to talk about the harm that our current system is doing to people and is doing to the planet, right? And I always it just feels like it is this, just like you were talking about, like the stickiness of solar and wind, of just being called alternative energy. There seems like there's this nonstop desire to say, okay, well, secretly clean energy is dirty. And it frustrates me the way that story is framed. Not that we shouldn't explore it, but frustrates me the way that that is framed.
I'm not sure what happened there, but I lost you. You were asking a
Oh no,
question about mining,
yes,
but I'm back. Can you hear me still?
I can hear you great. Let me make sure
All right. Well,
still recording.
I think I got your question, and I think I can answer it.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's no such thing as a free lunch, but there are more expensive lunches and less expensive lunches in the world. And the transition to renewables is a less expensive lunch in every way. It fantastically reduces the pollution impact on this planet. 9 million people a year die from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. That's one death in five. Anything we can do along these lines is a huge gain for human and environmental rights. In terms of mining, you're right that we need to make, and there are things we can and are beginning to do to make it a more humane and environmentally sound practice. But the really good news is you need to do a lot less of it once we make this transition. And if you think about it for a little while, you really get the reason why. And I go through this regularly with concerned, good hearted people who are worried about the mining effects. If you go mine some lithium, you put it in a battery, it does its thing for 25 years. If the battery degrades, we now are able and are recycling that commercially valuable lithium and getting almost all of it back to start again with the next battery. If you go mine some coal, what do? You set it on fire and you have to go mine some more tomorrow. The Rocky Mountain Institute estimated in the fall that all the mining you need for the batteries between now and 2050 is probably less volume than the volume of coal we mined last year. A way to think about this is a ship full of solar panels that you cross the Atlantic and install here someplace in the States. That ship full of solar panels will, in its lifetime, produce about 500 times as much energy as a shipload of coal that you ship across the ocean. This is a very, very different world that we're talking about building here. And people who want to reduce the material impact of humans on the planet should be the very first people in line to try and speed this transition.
You document, as you mentioned, so much of the clean energy boom that's happening around the globe. What do you see as the biggest opportunity for the global south?
So I think there's two huge opportunities depending on sort of where you are in the global south. There's almost a billion people who still have no access to electricity. And for them, no question, the quickest, easiest, cheapest way to do this is not to wait for someone to build a grid, because across much of rural Africa, that's not going to happen. It's to get solar mini grids that are now starting to pop up and work exceptionally well. And I've seen them in operation, and it's kind of a miracle. That's at the most granular, hut by hut level. At the nation state level, this is also an extraordinary opportunity. 80% of the world's population lives in countries that import fossil fuels. The reason, above all, that countries get into problems with balance of trade and huge debt issues and stuff is because they keep having to pay for the next tanker load full of diesel that's at anchor out in the harbor. Even big, sophisticated countries like India, 5%, it pays the equivalent of 5% of its GDP every year just to import fossil fuel. Um, think of the number of hospitals, schools, whatever you could build if you weren't wasting that kind of money on something that exists in your own place, just in a different form. Because every country in the world, most countries in the world have no gas or oil. Every country has sun and wind in sufficient quantities to get done everything they want to do. So this is a, you know, for 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 those of us in the rich West, there may be a certain complacency about this. We've had electricity our entire lives. If we flip the switch, it may not make that much difference to us where it comes from. It should, because one of those sources is destroying our climate and the other isn't. But if you're in the developing world, well, this is the greatest possibility for a kind of independent, robust development that they've ever had.
We are seeing so much innovation, as I was talking about, and so many new ways of approaching solar and wind, so many innovations and battery storage. And it's also just the drop in cost is so astonishing. And it's incredible to see what is happening in Australia with the cost of rooftop solar. It is remarkable to see what's happening in Germany with people putting solar panels on their balconies. I mean, I think it's over a million people, who are a million homes that have done this. It seems like it's a lot harder in the United States to do some
Yes.
of these things or enjoy some of these costs. Why is
Yep.
that the case?
Well, a number of reasons, but and our tariffs aren't helping, and the endless opposition of the fossil fuel industry is an attempt to drive up those costs at all times. But there are plenty of things we can do about it. And it's one of the focuses of Sunday, as people will see if they go to sunday.earth and sign up. I've been doing a lot of writing recently about permitting in this country. If you're in Australia or the EU, not only does it cost a third as much, literally, to put solar on your roof as it does here, it also happens incredibly fast. If you call up a contractor on Monday, there's every chance that you'll have your roof covered with solar panels and producing power by Friday. Whereas in this country, you're talking about months and months and months and months of expense and wait. That's mostly because we have this Byzantine Baroque permitting system. There's 15,000 different jurisdictions in this country, every city and town and county. They each have their own set of inspectors, their own set of codes, own demands for wiring, diagrams, on and on and on. It's not like this is really all that necessary. There's not an epidemic of rooftop solar panel fires sweeping across Australia, even though 40% of the country has solar on the roof. If there was such an epidemic, by the way, you would know about it because it would be on Fox News 24/7. We have a relatively easy first fix. There's a thing called the Solar App Plus that the National Renewable Energies Laboratory designed, but then spun off as a nonprofit. It allows for basically instant permitting. A contractor plugs in the specifications of the roof he's working on, slope, wiring that kind of thing, and then plugs in the equipment that he's installing. And if it checks, then the system writes him a permit. California, Maryland, and as of a couple of weeks ago, New Jersey have adopted this idea, and they're mandating that their localities start to use this, which speeds things up dramatically. As for that gorgeous balcony solar that's all across Europe now, I mean, you just walk into the Best Buy in Germany, plunk down a few €100, come home with a solar panel designed to hang from the railing of your, apartment balcony, plug it directly into the wall, and you're producing 20-25% of the power you use. Um, in the U.S., that's illegal everywhere, except except that progressive bastion, Utah, where the state legislature unanimously passed enabling legislation for balcony solar earlier this year because one libertarian state senator said, well, why the hell can you do this in Hamburg and Frankfurt and not in Salt Lake City and Provo? What's the problem here, guys? And there was no problem. So now I just watched last night a YouTube video from some guy with 9 million followers, someplace in Salt Lake City, happily installing his balcony solar. It's underway. So there's we can't do anything in Washington right now except try to play defense mostly through the courts to try and preserve whatever we can of the IRA. But we can go on the offensive in lots of cities and states around the country. It may be easiest in blue cities and states, but maybe not, because truthfully, the kind of anti regulatory sense in a lot of red states is our friend here. It's ridiculous I mean, it's putting a solar panel on your roof should require no more regulatory problem than putting a new refrigerator in your kitchen. If we can get to that point, then the cost will drop dramatically. And America, which has amazing amounts of sunlight across vast swaths of the country, will get to do this. I live in Vermont, where our solar resource is on the small side, but because Vermonters are environmentally minded, and we have one of the highest rates in the country, mine's been up there for a quarter century, back when it was expensive to put up, and still firing away just fine. In fact, the most remarkable statistic or idea in of course of writing this book was that our progress in solar panels and solar technology has been so swift. These panels get so much better all the time that if I took down a solar panel I'd installed in the year 2000 and recycled it, the silver and other components from it would be enough to build 7 or 8 new solar panels now. It's not just recycling. It's a kind of not like a circular economy. It's like a Mobius strip, that's produced. It's truly amazing what happens when you're dealing with something that's less a resource like coal or gas or oil and more a product of human intelligence like a solar panel. Because human intelligence, forget artificial intelligence, our brains have done an excellent job of figuring out how to bring down the cost of this over and over and over again.
You bring up artificial intelligence, and that is a great segue because I think,
Yeah.
like like you, reading this book, reading those numbers in California, and just over the course of doing this work, nothing has been more inspiring than seeing how people are deploying clean energy, see the solutions drop in price. The thing that makes me the most scared as we see artificial intelligence and data centers and the rise of new energy needs is what, even as we deploy these clean technologies, what is going to keep people from burning fossil fuels. And I don't know, like, even, and I'll be talking about this in the coming weeks, like, to have a true energy transition is gonna be like something we may not have done in all of history. and to keep people from burning to truly get off of fossil fuels, I am much less optimistic that that will be the case than I am that we will dramatically scale clean energy. And what I hope is that the dominant narrative around the all above energy approach doesn't continue. But I don't know what will be the thing that stops it.
Yeah.
I'm curious
Well,
what you think.
this is exactly why activists have a huge role to play here. There's a temptation to say, well, economics will take care of it. The price is falling, so, and I think that that price is so persuasive that over time it will. I think 30 years from now we're going to run the planet on sun and wind because it's just it's as close to free as you get in this world. But that doesn't help us much. Um, if it takes us anything like 30 years to get there, then the planet we run on sun and wind will be a broken planet. So our job is to speed up this process. And we do that in many ways with lots of activism. And one of the most important ways of doing that is just what you're doing and what I'm doing now with Here Comes the Sun. It's storytelling, it's letting people know what's out there, what the possibilities are. And when people hear that, they get excited. Now, you can do that in many ways, all of them important. I have a wonkish side and I really enjoy writing about all the nitty gritty details. But I also understand that the human brain is a fascinating thing. It's got two hemispheres. One of them likes detailed information. Environmentalists are good at that part, the part that responds to bar graphs and pie charts and stuff. That we've done our thing there. There's also a part of the human brain and the human heart that responds much more viscerally to the world. And it can respond to fear of something strange and different. That's what the oil industry has been playing on. Or it can respond to kind of hope and beauty. And there's something deeply, deeply beautiful about this transition. Um, when we get to Sunday, there's a lot of art that goes with it. If you go to sunday.earth, you can see 10,000 people have drawn gorgeous versions of the sun logo that we're using. And there's a lot of music. I borrowed the title of this new book straight from George Harrison. There are 100 great songs about the human love of our local star. 3 by the Beatles alone. Here Comes the Sun, just being the very best of them. But there's dozens of others. You have to work pretty hard to find kind of odes to, natural gas. There's not the same kind of powerful human connection in that way. And I think that people, if we can get them to stop to think that way, begin to understand just what a beautiful idea. I mean, look, the sun already gives us light, it already gives us warmth, it already gives us photosynthesis. Now it's offering us all the power we could ever use. And that's a gorgeous proposition. If we can take it in time, then we have a way to at least soften the impact of the greatest crisis we've ever wandered into.
One of the things that will be critical for the climate movement is as we accelerate clean energy development, how do we ensure climate justice, autonomy of communities, and not repeat so many of the mistakes that have happened in the United States, especially as there was massive infrastructure build out, especially in the second half of the 20th century. How will you hope in the coming years, if we are able to make big changes at state and local governments to accelerate permitting to accelerate clean energy, what is the role of the climate movement in ensuring that we're not just harming communities and taking away people's agencies and having wealth concentrate like it has in a fossil fuel economy?
Yep. Very good question. And it's one of the real tragedies of what's happening in Washington now that we gutting the IRA because the IRA, for the first time of any kind of legislation in our nation's history, paid real attention to this question, gave real advantages to people living in poor communities, in what they called energy communities that had been damaged by fossil fuel development over the years, on and on and on. Without that, we're going to have to be vigilant. But the good news is that in the largest sense, this is liberatory for communities of all kinds, maybe especially poor ones. Um, the the possibility of producing your energy from something you have at hand, instead of having to write a check that you send to Houston or Saudi Arabia, is particularly nice for poorer communities. For rich people, what doesn't really make any difference, you know? Energy is a relatively small part of your uh, budget, but that's not the case for more vulnerable communities. And the idea of having some control over where that energy comes from is really appealing. I will add that it's not just around economic questions that control is appealing. One of the things that turns out to be a bad idea about fossil fuels is that because they're only available in a few places, the people who control those places end up with way too much power, which they misuse in every possible way. Um, just to give the most pertinent example this week, you know, Vladimir Putin's the biggest fossil fuel baron in Europe, and he's used his winnings to launch a land war in the 21st century. That's criminal, but it's only possible. I mean, you know, Vladimir Putin without oil and gas is not much more powerful than you or me. Um, um, in fact, if you think about it, just try to imagine what the world's geopolitics over the last 50 years would look like if oil were not a valuable commodity. How much less fighting we would have done. I, Even human beings, troubled though we are, will find it difficult, I think, to figure out how to fight a war over sunshine. And that's very good news for everyone.
Well, again, the book is called Here Comes the Sun. People can go to sunday.earth. I'm going to, Bill, I promise you, I'm going to say on the podcast, I'm going to figure out what we can do in Indianapolis on Sunday. I'm super excited about this. Super excited about it, that it's happening. Super excited that it's happening in the United States in a year where I think a lot of us would love to no pun intended, put our energy toward that. And reading this book, it was focusing and motivating in a ways which I think so many people need it. And I just gotta ask you before we go here, my co-host and I will argue that George Harrison had the most interesting solo career of any Beatle. I'm curious where you fall on that debate.
Absolutely, man. I was reflecting the other day that I'm old, so the first record album I ever bought with my own money was Abbey Road, which, by the way, is a high bar to meet thereafter. If that was your first record, and I liked side. There were songs on side one that I liked back when we had sides on records. Was his garden that was appealing to a 9-year old, and Maxwell's Silver Hammer and things. But when I flipped it over and heard the first few bars of Here Comes the Sun, I was like, wow, this is something else. And it turns out I'm not alone, nor you. If you go on Spotify and look at it, Here Comes the Sun is the most streamed Beatles song out of their vast catalog, twice as popular as Let It Be or Hey Jude. So somehow, hanging around with Lennon and McCartney all those years, George Harrison was absorbing something, because he wrote that song, the best song of the late Beatles era. And then you're right, just the solo career that just was just sublime. Um, I, 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 I've been listening to many different versions of Here Comes the Sun these last weeks as we get ready for Sunday. We have a wonderful musical ambassador for Sunday, a woman named Antonique Smith, who has her own fantastic version. But when I really feel the need to just pull myself up by my bootstraps, it's the great Nina Simone. From a year or two after Abbey Road, whose version is just absolutely no nonsense. Get at this, go for it, boys. And that's where we are. We've got a shot now. Let's take it, man.
So well put, Bill McKibben. Thank you again for joining me on the Climate Pod.
Take care.